We've seen that the ASP.NET Core Web API works, but we need to make it do something more useful. Every web application or API is going to need a way to store data in a database, and that's what we'll look at in this video. I'll show you how to use Entity Framework Core, an object relational manager that comes as part of .NET Core, to talk to a database using C# instead of SQL. Then I'll integrate the model into the Web API, and later we'll write a new controller to work with the data. We're going to see a lot of code in this video. I'll start off by making a model class. For Conference Barrel, everything is centered around conferences, so the first model I'll write is a conference. In Visual Studio Code, first I'll make sure that the Explorer panel is open. Then I'll right-click in the Explorer pane and I'll create a new folder and call it Models. Then inside of the Models folder, I'll create a new class. I could create a new file and start the class from scratch, but there's a lot of boilerplate that can be generated automatically. Fortunately, there's a Visual Studio Code extension which can do this for me. I'm going to open the Extensions panel, and then I'm going to search for C# extensions. This one right here, by J.C. Hannon, is the one that I want. This extension will create new C# files, but generate class bodies and the names as well. It will also declare namespaces from the file structure. So now I'll open the Explorer pane again, and I'll right-click on the Models folder. I'll select New C# class, and I'll name it Conference. Visual Studio Code will create a new C# file with the name of conference.cs. Inside is a new class called Conference inside of a namespace, server.models, based on the file tree. You might have noticed that the extension can also generate interfaces. This may seem like a small thing, but it's much faster and less error-prone than copy and paste. Inside of the Conference class, I'm going to declare some auto properties to represent the data in the conference. First, I need an auto increment identifier. So, I'll type prop and then I'll hit tab. Prop is a snippet that will stub out an auto property for me. It also selects the type so that I can edit it. In this case, I'm okay with an integer, so I'll press tab to go to the name of the property. Then I'll change that to conference ID so that EF Core will pick it up as the primary key and press tab again. And it's that easy to write an auto property with Visual Studio Code. Now I can write the rest of the class. I'm going to need a string for the title, and then I'm also going to need a date time for the date. Notice the red line underneath date time, and that's because date time lives in the system namespace, which is not included in the file. Now Visual Studio Code can fix this. Whenever you see an error, if you put the cursor on the code that's causing the error, you can press Control period or Command period on the Mac, and that's going to bring up this quick fix menu. Now, it doesn't solve 100% of the problems, but it solves enough that it definitely will save time. In this case, when I bring up the menu, it gives me the option to use the system namespace, which it will place at the top of the file, and that's what I wanted. Now I can finish off the property. And the final property is going to be a decimal for the ticket cost. Now, of course, this is a demo, and a real class would be more exhaustive, but this will get us started. Now I need to tell Entity Framework about the model, and I'm going to use a DB context class to do this. So I'll right-click in the Models folder, and I'll select New C# class again. Now I'm going to call this one Data Context. The Data Context class derives from DB Context. DB Context lives in the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core namespace, but I can bring that in with the quick fix menu. Next, I'm going to need a constructor for data context. There's a snippet for that as well, CTOR. I'll hit Tab to change the name of the constructor to data context. And then it's also going to take a DB context options. Now the only thing that we're going to do here is simply pass that to the base constructor. And there are other things that you can do here within the constructor, but for now we can just leave the body empty. And the only thing that data context needs is a way to communicate between the conference class and table that EF Core will generate in the database. And this is called a DB set. And I'll use another auto property for this. So prop and then DB set. Now DB set is a generic class, and the type that I'm going to use here is my model class, which will be conference. And I'll call it conferences. To tell ASP.NET Core about the data context, I'm going to do this in the startup class, so I'll press Control P and bring up startup. And then the configure services method is where we add services to the application. In this case, I'll use add DB context. This is a generic method that needs to know about the type of DB context, which is going to be data context. And I'll use the quick fix menu to bring that in. Add DB context needs a lambda expression to configure the context. I'll use this to tell EF Core to store data in a SQLite database. So the lambda has a single parameter, which is a DB context options builder, and on that I'll call the use SQLite method. Now use SQLite lives in the Microsoft Entity Framework Core namespace. However, the quick fix menu doesn't agree. This is because use SQLite is an extension method, and the extension methods have been placed in a separate NuGet file. This is also new in 2.1. In earlier versions, they were part of EF Core out of the box. But this gives us an excuse to see another cool extension. So again, I'm going to open the extensions panel, and I'm going to search for NuGet Package Manager. This one here by JMROG is the one that I want. I'm going to install it, and then I'll reload Visual Studio Code. Now I'll open the command palette with Control-Shift-P, and in the search bar I'll type NuGet, looking for NuGet Package Manager, and select the option to add a new package. Then I'm going to search for Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and this is case sensitive. I'll hit enter, and I'm looking for this SQLite package right here. I'll select the most recent version, and what this will do is create a new entry in the CS project file to indicate that the project depends on this new package. Now if I press Control P and look in that CS project file, I can see that a new entry has been added. Now the thing is, this doesn't fetch the package, it only adds the dependency. Visual Studio Code will recognize that the package is missing and prompt to run a restore, which is a subcommand of the .NET tool, and that will resolve the dependency. I can click restore here in the prompt to do that for me. Now if I go back to Startup CS, the quick fix menu recognizes that I need to add the namespace. The use SQLite method accepts a connection string. For SQLite, this is very simple. It's just a file path. So data source equals conference barrel.db, and close that off with a semicolon. Now in practice, hard coding connection strings, or really any other string, is not appreciated. So .NET Core has a way that we can store them outside of the code, and this is going to be in the appsettings.json file, which lives in the root of the project. This is where we can store configuration values and retrieve them inside of the code. This way the configurations can be changed without rebuilding the application. Notice that there are two app settings files. one for development, and one for production. The development file takes precedence when the project is running in development mode, which is defined in the ASP.NET Core environment variable, which is in the launch settings file, the launch settings JSON file in the properties folder. However, I'm just going to put it in the production file for now to keep the demo code simple. Connection strings always go in an object named connection strings. I'll name the connection string SQLite, and then I'll provide it with the value. And don't forget the comma after the new object. I'll save that, and I'll go back to startup.cs. Now I'm going to use an instance of the configuration in the startup class to get the connection string for SQLite. So I'll remove the connection string, the hard-coded connection string, and I'll say configuration.get connection string, and then I'll pass it the name of the connection string, which was SQLite. And that's the configuration of EF Core. Now, to actually get a database, I'm going to use a migration. And a migration is like a snapshot of the structure of a database at a particular point in time. It stores the instructions for recreating the structure of the database, but not the data. And migrations are cumulative. So what happens is you create a migration every time you make a change to the model, and the migration will represent the recent change, but not the previous ones. This lets you restore the database to any point for which a migration exists. To work with migrations, I'm going to return to the command line, and I'll use the .NET tool. The subcommand EF lets me work with Entity Framework. To create a new migration, I'll start off with .NET EF, and then I'll use the migrations command, tell it to add a migration, and I'm going to call this conference for the conference model. Notice that a new folder, Migrations, is added to the project. Inside are C# files with the code to apply the migrations. In this first one, the migration will create a database that can store the conference class. Notice that there's an up method, which applies the changes, and there's also a down method that reverts them. We won't be modifying these files, but it's a good practice to look inside of them for any glaring errors before applying them. To apply the migration, I'll use the database update command. Notice that the conference barrel DB file for SQLite now appears in the project. That's enough for this video. In the next, I'll create a controller to store and retrieve conference data. We'll also be able to see the data inside of the database itself. Then we'll see how easy it is to move the application to SQL Server. Thanks for watching.